Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Alright, today we're going to be covering the abolitionist movement during the early and mid 19th century. So, as we know, slavery has been around since really the dawn of time, right? It's across the world. The early Egyptians had slaves, the Roman Empire had slaves. Slaves was even mentioned back in Mesopotamian time in the Code of Hammurabi. So, slaves have been around for pretty much forever. It came to the United States, or actually the 13 colonies, in 1619. The Atlantic slave trade started to happen around that time, so we're talking about a long time. Now, so in the colonies, the northern colonies, of course, they were the smaller colonies. They didn't have the large plantation farming. There were some northern colonists who started to become abolitionists. These abolitionists were people who wanted to eradicate or get rid of slavery. They came from different backgrounds and they had different reasons to oppose the institution of slavery. After the United States was formed during the 19th century, opposition to slavery became more prevalent, of course. Many believed that African Americans should be treated the same way. However, there was a good portion of Americans in the South specifically who did not feel that slaves and or African Americans and whites should be treated the same or equally under the law. So by the 1830s, some Americans really took some more organized action to support the abolition movement. Now, when we talk about the abolition movement in the United States, we have to really say it starts getting huge after the invention of the cotton gin, because it's really the invention of the cotton gin that was the big push for slavery in the United States. Up until the invention of the cotton gin, slavery was kind of on the decline. But after the cotton gin, the cotton industry exploded. It really expanded across the South, and it really made slavery deeply entrenched into the Southern livelihood. And so that really caused a big tear or big sectionalism in the United States between the northern abolitionist states and the southern slave-owning states. So there were some attempts early on to try to mitigate slavery, or even ideas to allow to have slave people leave the United States. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was founded to establish a colony of freed slaves in Africa. In the 1820s, funds were raised to allow some slaves to take a trip back to Africa or back to their motherland. And in 1822, Liberia was created as a haven for American slaves. Other attempts to try to quell slavery is the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820, when Missouri applied to be a part of the Union as a slave state. Maine was created to offset the representation in Congress. In its attempt to limit slavery, the 3630 line was drawn across the United States, in which states above the 3630 line in the New Orleans Territory or the Louisiana Territory could not be slave owning, and the smaller portion underneath could. So the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 banned slavery in the movement westward. Andrew Jackson refused to annex Texas because of slavery. So you have all these different things going on in the government, and it wasn't really always just annexing states, or it has to do with states. In the 1800s, the government even passed a gag rule in the House of Representatives, which forbade the discussion of any bills that even restricted slavery. Abolitionists were attacked in the North because of their beliefs. Churches in the North were really abolitionists. They were behind the abolitionist movement. However, the churches in the South really used the Bible as a defense for slavery. So when we come down to abolition and slaves, many slaves didn't want to leave America because they really felt that by the 1800s, many of them hadn't even stepped foot in Africa, and they really believed that the country was built upon their backs, and that's absolutely right. So let's get into some of the new abolitionists, what we're talking about in the 1800s. So, like I said, an abolitionist is somebody who wanted to eradicate slavery, get rid of slavery. The northern states were really the pushers of this early on. There was no plantation farms in the North, so it really makes sense. In the 1800s, a young man named William Lloyd Garrison was working as an apprentice at a Newburyport Herald, a newspaper in Massachusetts. And in 1828, he met a guy named Benjamin Lundy, who was an anti-slavery editor for an emancipation newspaper. Lundy offered Garrison a job. Garrison took it, and it is here where William Lloyd Garrison realized his calling in life was to become an abolitionist. William Lloyd Garrison would go on to write a newspaper called The Liberator, which spoke out against slavery and the harshness of the institution of slavery. In 1832, he helped form the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1833, he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. You have other prominent abolitionists in the 19th century. We've discussed the Grimke sisters before, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They were both Southern women who wrote anti-slavery pamphlets and booklets, including American Slavery as It Is. And we also had Sojourner Truth. Now, if you remember about Sojourner Truth, she was an African-American abolitionist. She believed that God sent her to Earth to spread the word against slavery, that she was a traveler to spread the truth, so she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. She was an escaped slave. She couldn't read or write, but man, was she big. She gave some really good speeches. Other influential African-Americans in the abolitionist movement was this guy right here. This was Frederick Douglass. He was a slave. He escaped slavery at 21 years old, and he became one of the most important African-American leaders in the 1800s. Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He took the name Douglass because he didn't want to be recognized and returned to his owner after he escaped. Now, here's the deal with Frederick Douglass. He was highly educated. Now, we all know that because of slave codes, that slaves were not allowed to be educated. So there are a lot of historians out there who believe that even though Douglass started telling these stories, especially in 1841 when he spoke to white crowds about what it was like to be a slave, people argued it because they were like, wait a minute, slaves weren't supposed to be educated, and this guy's coming off really, really educated. He's really smart. So how is this possible that this gentleman here, Frederick Douglass, was a slave, escaped slave at 21, but is really educated? So there are some stories behind, Frederick Douglass being an escaped slave who talked to white crowds across the country about abolitionists, but he was able to do it, and that's the narrative that we are going to go by. So what else happens during the abolitionist movement? We use the Underground Railroad. Any good cause requires men and women with grandiose ideas, and the abolitionist movement was really no different. However, ideas, no matter how big the size, are just not enough to make change. These abolitionists knew that action was needed to be taken, and in the 1830s, they organized what we call the Underground Railroad to help enslaved African Americans escape. The railroad was not a physical road at all, like it wasn't a railroad, it wasn't on tracks. You didn't have transports that took people to the north, but it was really quite the opposite of that. In the 1830s, a loose group of abolitionists created this Underground Railroad, which had begun really helping slaves escape from the South. And the Underground Railroad was a network of people who arranged transportation and hiding places for fugitives or escaped slaves. White and black people alike would be conductors, what we call, of the route escaping the South, going as north into Canada. So these conductors would take fugitives or slaves, would travel along these routes, leading them from slave-owning southern states to these northern states, and stopping by what we would call like stations, kind of like train stations, usually under the cover of darkness, to protect them from the harm of being returned to their masters, of getting caught, and everything like that. So if these slaves were caught and returned, they would experience like unheard of barbarity. These stations were usually homes and churches, any safe place to rest and eat before continuing to the journey to freedom. Many times these white people would pretend to be slave owners to protect these slaves on the trail. So these slaves would take the railroad by themselves. They would look for signals for the next safe place to rest their head. And it was a risky business because there were sheriffs and slave catchers who were always on the heels of these escapees, and they were on the lookout for all these slaves and all these fugitives. And between 1830 and the end of the Civil War, more than like 3,200 people who have known to have actually worked on this Underground Railroad, and really most of them will never ever be known for the heroics that they did. One of the most famous and most successful conductors of the Underground Railroad was none other than Harriet Tubman. We don't really know when Tubman was born, but it was probably between 1820 and 1825. She was named Amarinta Harris Ross. She's nicknamed Minty by her parents. She changed her name to Harriet around the time of her marriage when she got married. And between 1850 and 1860, Harriet Tubman made probably around 19 to 20 trips from the south to the north following the Underground Railroad. She wound up guiding over 300 slaves on the railroad, including her parents, a couple of her brothers and sisters. Harriet Tubman was no rookie to the Underground Railroad. I mean, she first heard about it when her and her brothers attempted to take it. And then once they found out that there was a reward on their head, her brothers split. And once she found out that they were safe back at the plantation, she went by herself. She carried a pistol when she was running the railroad. And, she would threaten to shoot these people who had second thoughts of escaping. That's how serious this was. They could not let anybody know where the railroad was. So when the Civil War broke out, that's when Harriet Tubman was used as a spy, because she knew all about the Underground Railroad. We have slaves that followed many different routes to freedom. There was dangers around every corner, of course, for the slaves. It wasn't certain if they were able to even get their freedom when they got to the free states, because the law still considered them as property. Bounty hunters were paid to hunt down the captive and capture the slaves and return any fugitives they found back to the South. And many Americans became famous because of their help on the railroad, too. Levi Coffin, he had a safe house in North Carolina in which there was a small room behind like a bed with a small door that was covered, like you could see here, right? This would be this little room right here that the slaves or fugitives would be hiding in, which was behind the beds, behind a little door. So despite the efforts of many abolitionists, many Americans remained still opposed to ending slavery, while many right Northerners agreed with the South and some supported slavery. It was kind of like a, if I don't see it, doesn't affect me type deal. And many white Northerners felt that if slavery were to end, many of the jobs in the North would be taken away from freed slaves who would work for a lot less. And Southerners felt that slavery was a vital part of their economy. So there wasn't all supporters in the abolitionist movement. Some were still against abolition. To end the story, we're going to end it with Henry Box Brown. Henry Box Brown was a slave on a Virginia plantation. He would go to the mail road, the mail station on the railroad, and he would find the biggest box that he can find, and he actually mailed himself to freedom. He left Virginia to Philadelphia. He was in a box that said dry goods and fragile, handle with care. All he had was some crackers, some water, and 27 hours later, he arrives in Philadelphia at the Anti-Slavery Society and actually has his freedom. Frederick Douglass gets mad at Henry Brown when he tells everybody how he did it. He's like, yeah, I burnt my hand with some acid, and my slave owner said I still couldn't, stop working, so I burnt it even more. Like, he literally, burnt it down to the bones, melted his skin off down to the bones. Finally was able to get some time off, got himself packed up in a little box you can see right there, 3 foot by 2 foot by 2.5 foot, and got himself mailed to freedom.